So what we had seen, you'll probably remember it if you were with us at that time. B'davar im yachol lahafrish tzedakah shelo l'tzorech achiv. Can I take all of my tzedakah money give it to my brother, kedei sheyuchal leishev b'shal va'achar nisuin v'lilmod Torah ezeh shanim. And I'm doing that so he could sit and learn for a number of years after his wedding. So I want to support my brother. He could work if he wanted to. That was the premise of the shaila. But he loves learning Torah, and he can only do it if he has a supporter, a sponsor. And so that's the question. This was what was presented to Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe had gone through a number of different issues, like is it appropriate for a person to decide not to work and learn instead? Is it even appropriate, from a derech eretz standpoint? And he concluded that that if a person chooses to be a Levi, like the Rambam says, he has a right to do so, meaning Levi in the more generic sense of being a person who ministers unto the Jewish people and decides to eschew worldly pursuits for the sake of Torah study. But a person has to examine himself and decide whether that's the right thing for him. So I know it's a little bit small, the text, so in light of what someone just mentioned before. So you can see it? You're okay? Okay, great. Can everyone, do you want me to make whoops, what happened here? Let me try this again. There we go. Maybe what I'll do is I'll make the font a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, now read the first line. Okay. Okay, so let's just look at this paragraph. He says, Hanachon lanius daiti, sheyesh chiluk bozeh bein hayachid al hatzdaka shelo, legabai al kis shel tzedakah. He says, as far as what you're allowed to use the money for tzedakah for, as far as the prioritizations that we talked about before, there's a big differences, Rav Moshe, between an individual's money and the money that is entrusted to a gabbai tzedakah. Let's say I'm considered a gabbai tzedakah because I have a fund that the members of our community contribute to, and they rely on me to make distributions to people who are needy in our community. Okay, that's what we call the Buy a Charity Fund, and people generally give. We try to replenish the fund before the high holidays, and I make distributions. I give out around $25,000 to different individuals for Rosh Hashanah. I do another distribution of the same amount before Purim, and then another distribution of approximately the same amount before Pesach. Okay, so I have a list of people that are local, that most of them are even as local as Thornhill. We have a handful that are outside of the Thornhill, but in the GTA. And then we have some other tzedakot that are, let's say, we have maybe 2 or 3 that are in Israel that we give to, that run soup kitchens that we know that are worthy of our support, because we've had a pattern of giving them free for years. But that's generally the distribution of our tzedakah. So he says, "Di yachid al tzedakah stam shelo yesh lo tovas hana l'sita l'mi sheyirtza me'osan sherishayin l'kabel tzedakah." He says, despite all of the prioritizations, an individual has the absolute right to give tzedakah to whoever he feels he would like to give to, provided that that person qualifies as a tzedakah recipient. V'hu kamo tovas hana dematnos kahuna. He says, this is like what the Gemara talks about when it talks about tovas hana'ah. A person who's a farmer and who tithes his produce has the prerogative to give the truma to whichever Kohen he wants. There's no halacha that says that I have to distribute my truma equitably to different kohanim. If you happen to be my friend and you have a farm and you'd like to give me your truma, then you have every right to give all of it to me. You don't have to. It's your prerogative. Ve'ein chiluk eze kohen tzarech yoter lahamatanot. And not only that, but that's true even if there are more needy kohanim. Let's say I'm a popular kohen, but my neighbor, the kohen, is not as popular. So I get truma from enough people such that I have enough money to clothe my children, send them to yeshivas because of all the truma that I get. But there's another guy who doesn't get that much. He's not as well known. He's not as befriended as maybe other kohanim are. There's no obligation, even though, like in the laws of tzedakah, we learned before that if someone needs food and someone needs clothing, the person who needs food gets priority. But that's only true if I'm the gabbai tzedakah. I have to make that calculus. But if I'm a private citizen, I have a right to give to whichever charity I prefer. Va'ayin b'tosfos chulin daf kuf dalet alha dechalas chutz laaretz nitenes lechol kohen sheyirtzeh shehikshu meha de'enosden matana lekohen am haaretz. So Tosfos asks the question. He says, well, if that's the case, then why does the Gemara say that you should not give your truma to a kohen who's an ignoramus? Better that you should give it to a kohen who's a scholar. But if the prerogative is mine, then why can't I give it to whomever I wish? So v'tirtzu da'af be'ika kohen chaver v'rotza lekabel aval eno tzarich v'ha'am aretz ani yacholitein leha'ani. And Tosfos's conclusion is that it is an individual's right to give to a kohen who's an am haaretz if you feel in your heart that he would benefit more from the truma. Let's say there's a kohen who's a Talmud Chacham, and yet he's already got enough truma. He's well cared for already. If you feel that giving it to a kohen am haaretz will be a better use of your tzedakah money, that's your right to do so. And that's Tosfos's conclusion, despite the fact that in the hierarchy, a Talmud Chacham trumps an am haaretz. B'din zeh hu af b'matanos de'oraisa shehein chulin shelekach shash iser tuma. And this is true even with things that are chulin, that are non-tameh, that are not subject to tameh, to tuma. Va'av she'atos v'stav kuf lamed chisru b'tirutzim sham gam siyur zeh aval pashut shalom mishum de'b'matnos de'oraisa ein nosim b'chai gavn la'am haaretz. Okay, just skipping a little bit. Chazinan mifurash, the rakish rotzeh yachol litein laha'ani, aval yachol gam litein laha'asher af she'eino tzarech lahu. What we see from here, when it comes to my agricultural tithes, I can give it to whomever I want. I don't have to give it to the person who's more needy than the other person. V'zeh vaday lo mistaber lomer shehu rak b'talmud chacham asher ve'am haaretz ani sheyesh lahasher ma'alas talmud chacham shemin olam l'tosfos sheshkulim heim. Okay, and then I'm going to skip a little bit more. He says, in the conclusion, therefore, is v'im kain bevadai af b'shavin sheshneim talmidei chachamim u'shneim am haaretz yachol litin gam laha'asher. He says, and this is true based on logic, that even if both are of means, both kohanim are of means, or both kohanim are amei haaretz, I can give it to whichever one I prefer. Alma dedin tova sana sheyesh lo huzchus shelo litin lechol mi sheyirtzem elu sherashayin likach matnos kahuna. He says, and therefore, what you see from here is that the prerogative of giving to whomever I want as a donor, it lies squarely with the donor, regardless of the need and the hierarchy. The kevin sha'af ha'asher hu kohen v'roshai likach yochol litin lo kesherotza af sheyesh kohanim hatzrichim yoser. And what you see from this whole discussion is that you can give to whichever Kohen you want, even if there are more needy Kohanim. So Rav Moshe's Chiddush is the same applies to in the laws of tzedakah, that even though tzedakah is not a tithe, and by the way, truma tithes are given to Kohanim even if they're not poor. A Kohen doesn't have to be poor to be entitled to take truma. And this is where Rav Moshe says, even though you could make such a distinction, but I don't hold that that distinction exists. What you see from that, the laws of truma, is that the privilege of choosing which recipient is going to get my money is purely mine. He says, "Uchamochein b'tzedakah stam shelo sheyesh lo behen tovas hana yachol litin l'chol mi sheyirtza me'elu shorashan likach tzedakah av she'echad yoser tzarich." He says, and therefore, the only criterion that you need to fulfill in order to give someone tzedakah is that they truly qualify halachically for tzedakah, because they qualify as a poor person or as a person for whom this charity is would justify them to take community donations. And therefore, let's say you want to give to a guy who needs a new suit for Yantiv, but someone taps you on the shoulder and says, why should you give to that guy? I know somebody who can't afford to buy groceries for Yantiv. You should give to him better. So you say that your response to that fellow should be, thank you for your recommendation, but mind your own business. It's my money. I can give tzedakah to whomever I wish. Aval gabay al kis shel tzedakah she'en lo bahem v'gam lo lahanos nim zuchus tovas hana. He says, but this is the distinction. A gabay tzedakah does not have the prerogative to play favorites. It's not his money, right? It's only when it's your money that you have a right to play favorites and decide which charitable cause you want to give to. But when you're a gabbai tzedakah and you're working with community money, then you really do have to make more of a careful analysis of where the needs are greatest and give to those when you have limited funds. Kideisa b'simuration and aleph sifhei elahu hu din al hakohol lasas bahem hatov be'enei elokim va'adam. What you have a responsibility to do is to do that which is right in the eyes of God and man. So it really strikes me as quite interesting. What if a person is a gabbai tzedakah? He's a trustee on an estate. Does he have the right to decide based on his own personal preferences? Could be. Probably not, because basically he can say, as the gabbai tzedakah, I have to give where the need is greatest, using the hierarchical system. But when it's my own money, I'm a private citizen, or I could just give the money to my charitable fund and then use it, funnel it from there. I mean, here where there's a tax benefit to make a charitable donation, a lot of people will give money to the charity fund and instead of giving it to private individuals who are needy, and that way they get the tax write-off. But what they do lose is they lose the privilege of deciding who it goes to, although we do have directed giving. In other words, it happens quite often. Like we had a situation not too long ago where there was a person in our community who needed a pair of tefillin and couldn't afford it. So a group of guys got together and they said, our minyan's going to take up a collection for this guy, buy him a new pair of tefillin. So great. And so I said, okay, when you have the amount of money that you need, put it all in one check and earmark it, and we'll make sure that that money comes into the fund, and then we'll write a check to that individual and just give him the money. Now, if they had done that themselves, they wouldn't have gotten a charitable write-off. Okay. Kideisa sham v'hagaboim heim hamamuna mehakol alayhu ne'amar dina b'haktim So it's only the Gabbai Tzedakah who has this obligation to give the money to the higher priority, right? That, like, for example, a person needs food and another person needs clothes. The person who needs food takes priority. And similarly, assuming that the needs are equivalent, they don't have a right to give more to one person than to another. Now, I should also point out that I don't always structure the giving that way. There are people who are more part of our community who I give more to, and people who are less part of our community who I give less to. But that's based on a different criterion. It's not based on the need of the individual, but it's based on the principle that Aniye Ircha Kodman, that the poor of your city take priority. So let's say I have a person who's a member of the Bayit, davens in our shul, and I have another person who lives in Thornhill, but doesn't daven at the Bayit. I will give more to the person who's a member of the shul because that's considered more Aniye Ircha. That's the poor of your own community. They're just because they live geographically down the street from the shul, but if we never see them and they don't, not part of our shul community, so then I'll give them, but not as much as the person who's part of the shul community. Kiriisa b'simulation shemitchalakat b'shlosha kedine mominus. And the Gemara says that you should give it out in the presence of three people, meaning that it has to be done under supervision. Upirish Rashi la'ayin lases l'chol echad kafi tifalayim hatuluyin bo. And Rashi explains that the reason it has to be done under supervision of three people is because they have to be able to supervise that the distributions are being done equitably according to the hierarchies, priorities of tzedakah. V'hatam shehu memela kvar yesh lanim zuchus sheyasu kupi anochutz v'hatzorech v'hakdamos shesidru chachamim. Right, and therefore the proper way to distribute is based on need and other prioritizations that are detailed by the chachamim. V'chesheleka din hakadima kulam shavim bahem. And when one person does not have a higher priority than another, then they should be given equal amounts. He says, but if it's a private person's tzedakah money, and he simply wants to tithe his income, and he wants to give, let's say, $1,000 to tzedakah, he can give even all of it to whomever he wants. And therefore, even if there's a difference in need between two recipients, he can still give it to the person with lesser need than the person that he knows with greater need. So provided that the relative is allowed to accept tzedakah, then I can choose to give all of my money to my relative, even to the exclusion of someone who needs the money more than my relative. So that's Rav Moshe's Chiddush, and the author of this Hilchos Tzedakah that we're learning seems to say that this is a machlokas. In other words, Rav Moshe is giving us a big Chiddush here, because according to the Chasam Sofer that we saw, even when I have a right to give the money to my relative, I should really only give half of my tithes to my relative, and the other half I should give to the general community. And so you have a machlokas here as far as what the proper way to distribute tzedakah money is. Okay, so. Okay. Um, I would tell a person both opinions. And I would say, you see that this is a machlokas among the poskim, but ultimately you have a right to conduct yourself according to what your conscience tells you to do. That's generally how I do things. When there's a machlokas like this, especially when it comes to something so personal as someone's income, it's a very sensitive issue, you know. No one likes to be told how to spend their money. The person, you're right. I think you all agree to that, right? Yeah. Well, we have enough taxmen in our lives. You don't need another. You don't need the rabbi to be your tax man to tell you how to give your money. But I would tell a person. I said, look, it's your money. You've earned it. You have a right to use it as you wish. The hierarchical structure of tzedakah, who takes priority, is a guideline. It's not an absolute issue. And plus, there are so many different hierarchies. There's a hierarchy based on need. There's a hierarchy based on closeness to you, right? Your connection to you. And sometimes it's difficult to really make an evaluation of which one takes priority over the other. So therefore, the Chassam Sofer gives a very nice guideline. He says, split up your tzedakah money. Half should go to the general community fund so that it's distributed equally and equitably to, to whoever, the Gabbai thinks needs. And that way, that your tzedakah money will be reaching people that you normally wouldn't have been able to have access to, right? And then the other half use, as your passions guide you. Yeah, at your discretion, right? But if you have more limited funds and you really feel very strongly about a particular need and it's going to take up all of your tzedakah money for that year, you have a right to do that, as Rav Moshe says. That's what I would tell somebody. Make sense?
I think you are. Not cover a lot of. Like in other words, most of us really should be maybe thinking about the UJ as part of the process, but I'm not sure that's really happening from many.
What a timely comment, Ron. We're having a Shabbaton this Shabbos with UJA. First Shabbaton we've had in a number of years with them. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that the Orthodox community has an obligation to participate strongly in UJA campaigns. But it's actually not for the reason that you mentioned, in that they are an umbrella charity that distributes money far and wide. But it's actually more for the reason that when an Orthodox Jew doesn't have the UJA in his sights, he's really showing a lack of appreciation, a lack of gratitude for all of the millions of dollars that UJA pumps into our community. Just to give you one statistic, this local UJA invests $15 million in Jewish education every year, in tuition subsidies. I would dare say that the majority of those tuition subsidies go to Orthodox families. And if not the majority, then a sizable portion. So the fact that I can afford to send my child to school, and that so many other people can as well, and we don't participate in that campaign, that to me is a shanda. It's a shanda on our community, and it's a shameful stain for people who say, I won't, there are people who say, I won't participate in the Federation campaign because they give to LGBTQ causes also, which is to me, it's an absurd argument, or because they give to reforming conservative causes as well. Yeah, but what about the fact that you yourself have been able to afford to send your child to school because of tuition subsidies that have been giving you to Federation? Don't be a hypocrite. If you think that they're misusing the funds then you shouldn't accept funds from them. There's a lot of hypocrisy. And it's like the people who receive welfare in Israel and then take to the streets and demonstrate against the government, right? So that's not right. I understand that you don't want to take money from the government because you believe it's an evil government, so you won't take a penny. But what if your yeshiva is getting funded, or your shul or your kollel or whatever is getting funded by the government through subsidies, through welfare, and a whole bunch of different kinds of subsidies that exist in Israel? And then you're going to go and denounce the very hand that feeds you? That to me is a sign of a very distorted character. So that's the reason why we do a UJA. We're doing a UJA Shabbaton. So anyway, if you want to listen to the come Shabbos morning, you'll be able to hear the CEO of UJA, Adam Minsky. He's going to be giving the Bar Torah. He'll be speaking Shabbos morning in the main show. It's worth it. It's worth it to come upstairs, and even if you're at a different minyan, just to listen to him. Anyway. Okay. So just to finish this up, he says, "V'lachein kevin shezeh vadai she'af adam sheyesh lo masayim zuz im tzarachu lahasi bita rashai likach tzedakah lazeh." He says, and therefore it seems clear to me that even if a person already has 200 zuz, which is a sizable amount of money, and he needs to marry off his daughter, and the halacha would entitle him to take tzedakah to make his wedding, because you need more than 200 zuz to make a wedding. Kevin demi masayim zuz lo yaspik lo lazeh. The tam masayim zuz mishum shezeh maspik lo l'shana lemizonus uchasus. Right? He says, normally the Gemara says that if you have 200 zuz in the bank or in your pocket, you're not allowed to take tzedakah. But if you're making a wedding for your daughter and you can't afford the wedding hall, then you would be allowed to collect tzedakah, even if you have more than 200 zuz in the bank. V'gam barur sherashai lekabel al zet tzedakah, lo rak keshekavar nishtadcha v'karov lizman hachasana, ela af bizman kodem va'af below nishtadcha, kedei sheyi lo bameh l'shadcha ulahasiya. It also seems clear to me, says Rav Moshe, that a person would be allowed to collect tzedakah for marrying off his daughter, even before his daughter has gotten a shidduch. In other words, I got to start putting money away for my daughter's wedding. So yeah, because I know that eventually it's coming. And shidduchim sometimes go very quickly. She meets a guy, 2 weeks later they're engaged, 3 weeks later they're making the wedding. So a guy could say to himself, listen, it's going to take me more than 5 weeks to be able to get the money to afford the wedding. Would you mind giving me a nice donation to help me make my wedding? In Kain kol sheken keshechad rotza lisa isha kesheyagia zmano v'hisnadev levava lishkad al haTorah she efshelo lihisparnes imlo sheyitol as tzedakah. He says, and therefore it would seem clear to me that even more so, that if a person wishes to learn Torah, and he knows that he also wants to get married, and he knows that the only way he'll be able to support a wife is through charitable donations, then even before he gets married, he's allowed to accept tzedakah to be able to have enough money to get married and to set up his home. Shehitiru zelanu b'dorosenu kemufurish b'yoredeya, dafilu b'bari mutar. And therefore it is permissible for even a healthy, strapping young man to accept tzedakah. Shirashai gam kodem shenasa shadain ein lo hatzarach lekabel tzedakah bishvil hatzarach sheyilo achar hanisuin. It's permitted for a young man to go and solicit charity to make a wedding where he hasn't even met the girl yet. Okay. Okay, we'll have to hold it here for today, and Amir Hashem will continue the next shuvah on Monday. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody. And we'll see you.